Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to go through 12 different books that can fit within the umbrella of cozy, fun, and happy. Different things come to mind when people think of those adjectives, so I wanted to have some subcategories within these 12 recommendations so that way no matter what you think of when you hear those words, there will be hopefully something that fits your tastes. I do have a subcategory that truly is just fun books, but the three others besides that one, we have books that are relatable, books that are nostalgic and melancholy, and then books that are uplifting and charming. Before we get into it, as far as cozy books go, I have in the past done a video that is essentially like a guide to cozy fantasy, where I once again go through a variety of different kinds of books that fit within that subgenre, and I really give a sort of deep dive into all the different kinds of things that might fit your tastes. I don't have any overlap between that video and this one, but if you are looking for more cozy fantasy recommendations after this, I'll have that linked. And then also one additional thing as well, the majority of the books today are fantasy and specifically adult fantasy works. I do have a couple of other genres mixed in as well as one middle grade book. That way, hopefully, no matter what you have in mind, there will be something that, as I said before, fits your taste. Jumping into it, I'm going to start with the relatable factor. I definitely think a lot of us can't necessarily relate to going on an epic quest by any means or using a really awesome magic system or being warriors. So many of us are far from being warriors, so we can't necessarily connect on that level with stories, but there is something that is kind of fun, almost heartwarming, uplifting, happy, watching people go through the very simple, mundane things of day-to-day life and being able to overcome those things, find happiness, and persevere. I think that in its own way can kind of fit within all of those adjectives I said before. So the three books I'm going to mention for the relatable factor would be The Murderbot Diaries, The Phoenix Keeper, and Kiss Her Once for Me. So these three books are pretty different from each other. We'll start with The Murderbot Diaries. So this is technically considered science fiction, adult science fiction. And we follow this murder machine, and it has gained sentience and a sense of independence. It has its own thoughts and feelings, and it is grappling with those within a world where there are a lot of, you could almost say, misconceptions about individuals that are murder machines like Murderbot is, and you're kind of following them as they navigate through some circumstances that, for the most part, I think most readers who come to Murderbot don't really care that much about. Meaning the plot itself, which is kind of down with the evil corporation. A lot of us, I don't think, are like, wow, the plot, I just can't get enough of it. What a lot of people really connect to is the fact that Murderbot experiences what are basically the very things that so many of us experience: anxiety, depression, not necessarily knowing how to deal with other people, not knowing how to navigate social interactions, liking people, but also finding people so frustrating, and then also just trying to do your job. And when other people get in the way of that, this captures that so well. They are primarily novella length. There is a full-length novel that actually I quite enjoyed. I would say the majority of people actually like the novellas more though, but there are quite a few of these. Some entries for me are stronger than others, but they are absolutely a good time, and I very much appreciate this kind of quiet snarkiness that Murderbot definitely represents. And then as far as Kiss Her Once for Me, the relatability factor, this is contemporary, so you're already looking at a setting that very many of us can easily fit ourselves within. And I also think that the main characters, so many of their motivations are rooted in the fact that financially they are struggling quite a bit. They do have also issues with family members. I know it sounds a little bleak to say that a lot of us can really relate to the feeling of we have to live paycheck to paycheck and we're barely scraping by, and maybe the places that we're living in aren't the nicest and it needs work, but you don't have the money, so you just make do. And then if anything happens that disrupts your day-to-day life and makes it so that you can't necessarily work at an efficient level, you can't even make it to work, or just something occurs with a family member, if anything comes up, if there's any kind of little speck of dust in this machine, then you have no safety net. Which I know that the point of this is cozy, fun, happy, and I'm making this sound really depressing. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of us have been there, a lot of us have had to hustle, a lot of us have had to struggle, and the main character as a result of her financial struggles, ends up going into a very bizarre deal, as is the case with a lot of contemporary stories. And I honestly could easily see this going onto the big screen and just being a laugh out loud, silly romantic comedy. The setup is that because of her financial woes, our main character makes a deal with this guy that she knows who isn't able to access the money that his grandfather left behind in his will to him unless he gets married. And he doesn't want to get married. I will describe this character, and I think they even describe this character as a himbo. He's just doing his thing, living his life. He does not want to have to get married, but his grandfather had some very rigid, old-fashioned views and also some very concerning views as to why he didn't want him to get the money unless he was married. And so he wants to just get the money, and he figures, well, why don't you just marry me, and then we'll be together for a little bit, and then we'll just quietly separate, and I'll give you a percentage of the money. And she agrees to this outrageous plan. He is not necessarily the love interest in the story, and who the love interest actually is a little bit of a surprise and a little bit of a plot twist. It's not if you read the synopsis, of course, but I think it's more fun to go into that not really knowing, because it is a play on the arranged marriage trope, or the marriage of convenience. Not quite arranged, it's more a marriage of convenience trope. There's a play on that in that book that I think is a lot of fun. It's absolutely over the top and absolutely ridiculous, which in and of itself I think makes it really, really fun. But it is that feeling of like, oh, I don't have any money, what am I gonna do, that I think a lot of people can connect with. There's a gnat, speaking of relatability. And then The Phoenix Keeper truly feels like if you combined fantasy with contemporary. You follow this young woman who has such a passion for, in their world, they're basically just animals, because it's essentially like our own world, but what if at the zoo you also had mythological creatures? So she has a passion for these creatures, and very specifically the phoenixes. She is very hardworking, she's very knowledgeable, she does struggle with social anxiety, which does affect her job because they expect her to also do these shows and to interact with people who come to the magical zoo, and they also try to do these things so they can earn money from people, and then that money can go toward helping these animals and creatures. But our main character isn't good at that part. She just wants to look after them and build lovely, cute little relationships with them, and she connects so much more to the animals than she does to people, which that in and of itself is extremely relatable. But the aspect of how the story navigates our character's relationship with her job, and the way that she cares so much about what she does, it's all those little things that she has to do that I think, even if that's not even close to your profession, so many of us have experienced that. But watching the way that she works really hard to raise money for these animals, how she cares about the animals, and like watching the animals start to thrive and everything like that, I think all of those things make that book feel not just relatable, but there is a happiness component to it as well. Next up, I wanted to get into the ones that are more nostalgic and melancholy. I know melancholy in a sense feels contradictory in some ways to fun and happy, but I think in a sense, to be extremely cliche, sometimes melancholy exists as a means of almost being bittersweet, where you kind of feel that as, in a lot of ways, transition periods when you're going from childhood into adulthood, or you're more exposed to the world than you were before. You have certain experiences that make you miss something, and maybe there is this feeling of sadness, but there's something else as well that goes hand in hand with it. So there's a couple books on this, and actually one of them isn't necessarily a book, but it's still a recommendation I think a lot of people will want to check out. And the first one I'm going to mention is the one that's technically not a book, and that would be Frieren, Beyond Journey's End. You can watch this as an anime, and the first season currently, at the time of filming this, the first season is out. I myself plan to continue on with the manga to see where the story goes from there. Eventually, I'm sure we'll be getting our second season at some point. Also, I am going to be that person that recommends the sub, because I liked the sub more. But it doesn't really matter. However you come to the story is your choice. I think that this absolutely, if you are a fan of fantasy, this is going to fit in the nostalgia component very well, because it is basically a love letter to the fantasy fan, especially if you're a fan of RPGs, but also just kind of classic sword and sorcery type of fantasy, Dungeons and Dragons type of fantasy. You follow this elf who, as a result of living a much longer life than other individuals, including humans, she goes on this quest They save the world from this demon king, which kind of is like the Dark Lord type of character in a lot of stories. They save the world from that being. And then this story kicks off after that. And after that, our main character is realizing that a lot of the people that she went on this journey with, they are now old or passing away. It is finally hitting her the fact that even though she lives for a great amount of time, and even though logically she understands that she only has so much time with humans, she starts to realize how much she's almost taken for granted, and she is trying to care more about the little things. She's trying to understand the meaning of life, basically, and these connections that we have with other people, and actually really taking the time to appreciate other people in her life. And it's so sad when it first starts, because this is prompted by having lost somebody that she went on this journey with. As I said, this is where it starts, so it's not a spoiler. But she loses somebody she went on this journey with and then just realizes how much she misses them. And it's quite heartbreaking when it first starts. But then from there, you see her basically going on a new quest, and she's making new friends, you could say, and the way all of the characters are represented is really sweet and really lovely. We also have the book Ascendant. This is one that, even though I mentioned a lot of the fantasy books on this list are adult fantasy, and this technically fits into that, I've, in many times in talking about this, described this as essentially transcending age range, because any middle grade reader that really likes to go above and beyond and read the big chapter books, like how I think a lot of us felt when we were kids, if you yourself were a reader as a child, I think that there certainly is a lot to this that a lot of readers of that age can really get into. I also think that this is very fitting for a lot of young adult readers who fit within that demographic. And then also there's a lot to it that a lot of adults can enjoy. The world building, I think, is fantastic. The part of this, though, that feels so nostalgic is the fact that it is very much built upon the A Boy and His Dragon story and that setup. It absolutely does its own thing. It doesn't necessarily feel like a carbon copy of anything that we've gotten before, but I think a lot of times nostalgia is rooted in that sense of familiarity, which Frieren represents and Ascendant represents. The setup for this one, though, is that you follow this young man named Holt, and he is currently a cook. That is pretty much the only station he'll ever hold in life, but through some interesting circumstances, he finds himself responsible for a dragon egg, and then once that dragon hatches, he's now finding himself responsible for this new tiny baby dragon. The connection between these characters, the animal companion, mythological creature companion trope is really exceptionally done in that story. I also just in general really like the amount of time that the author allows us to spend within this world. It is, I would say, a little bit more epic in nature, but it has that sense of familiarity, which I think if you are somebody who isn't necessarily typically gravitating toward epic fantasy, maybe you even feel daunted by it, that could be a good one to sort of dip your toes into, because of the way that it allows you to kind of sit in this world and hear about the food that they're making and hear the connection between this young man and his dragon, the conversations that they have and how they try to lift each other up and their bond. I think there's so much to it that feels a little bit more intimate and closed off, but it still reaches some great epic heights. And I'm really excited to see where the series goes as it is currently continuing to be written. Next up, we have our one middle grade story of today, which would be The Girl Who Kept the Castle. This is just so darling and such a good time and so fun, and it really brought me back to being a kid and just getting lost in this kind of zany, fun story. And the setup is you follow this young girl who is one of the groundskeepers at this particular castle. And this castle is the home of the Wizard West, of which there are 4 wizards, one for each, as you guessed it, direction. And they all play a really pivotal role in keeping this particular area safe. Wizard West, turns out, dies. He is not accepting his death very well, though. He's still lingering around. The more he tries to use magic, the more that his existence is fading. So he's trying to not use magic, but he also doesn't want the rest of the kingdom to know that he is dead, and he isn't handling his death well whatsoever. Our main character is trying to help keep things afloat. He decides, what if I have a grand basically challenge where all these young apprentices compete to become my next protege and take my place, and it's only then that I can finally actually die. And our main character is trying to help put all of this together, and also he never knows what he's doing, the wizard, and so he doesn't realize how taxing this is on all the people that work at the castle. They're all trying to do their best, and our main character perhaps is more suited to difficult tasks than Wizard West realizes. While this is quite popular at this point and very talked about, I still felt it was important to mention this one. I think it combines nostalgia and melancholy really well, and it's absolutely really cozy, and that would be the Spellshop. Setup for this story is that you follow this young woman who is a librarian, and she just loves her peace and quiet and getting to hang out with her sentient spider plant. And as I'm saying this, I'm realizing apparently happy for me means, is there some kind of cute animal or companion that's not a person? You follow her and her sentient spider plant, and at the beginning of the story, there is some kind of uprising occurring, and the city is being burned. Our character, panicking, grabs as many of these magical tomes as she can and flees, and it is only after, when things are starting to settle down, that she realizes how dangerous it is for her to be in this predicament, as within their kingdom, anybody who takes any magical tome out of this library is at risk of some pretty serious punishments as a result of the fact that they do not want magic getting into the hands of people that they have deemed incapable of wielding and using it. So our main character, not knowing what the results were of the uprising, now feels she has to keep it a secret that she has these tomes, but where she fled to is very, very small, and everybody is in everybody's business, so she's kind of trying to keep it a secret, but perhaps her curiosity gets the best of her. She can't necessarily resist seeing how perhaps some of the magical spells within these books might help this community. She did originally grow up in this community, so the melancholy feeling is in a lot of ways rooted in how things have changed since she was a child, how she is feeling very alone in life, and this is in part because she doesn't really have her family anymore, and you explore those topics. It actually has some pretty sad moments, I think, even from when I talk about it, but just in general, a lot of us, when we talk about the Spellshop, we talk about how it's so cute. We talk about how the world's so whimsical. We talk about the romantic subplot being very, very sweet. We don't necessarily touch as often on the grief components that are explored, but they're explored really beautifully, and I think just kind of enhance the story overall because they really encompass a lot of different aspects of our life. I also wanted to mention You Can't Spell Treason Without T. This one has a really, really lovely established relationship, which I think is very rare. So often when we're reading stories, we're exploring characters falling in love, not necessarily characters who are in love and are taking the risky step of choosing a life with each other and what sacrifices you have to make when you do that, the compromises you have to make. One of our characters is a very powerful magic user. The other character previously served a very powerful person, and they're leaving that life behind, but there is danger that comes with them abandoning their current post. And so you are exploring that. I do think that this story balances the world building and the cozy and the romantic plotline all really, really nicely. It's very comfortable. Where I think the nostalgia factor comes into play is just purely the fact that it's building upon a very familiar foundation, similar to how, as an example, something like Legends and Lattes builds on a familiar foundation, but then has this little story where you're exploring the whole low stakes within an epic world. I think this one does that as well, and there's something about that a lot of us have tapped into and just really felt like this is what we want when we're looking for cozy, or when we're looking for a story that maybe isn't as intense as some of the high fantasy is. There's something about having this world that is very, very familiar, that feels very nostalgic, but exploring something that's a little bit more intimate than what we get in a lot of other fantasy books. Now getting into the it's just pure fun category, which by no means is me trying to dismiss the other aspects of these stories. It's just fun is such a great way to describe these. So I have two for today with this, which would be Soulless by Gail Carriger and The God and the Gumiho. When I've brought The God and the Gumiho up in the past, I have mentioned that this is basically an anime in book form. The characters are larger than life. Their reactions to things are super dramatic at times and so off the walls, and it's so much fun. It took me a second because I do feel like there's something about the medium of anime and manga that when characters are being over the top, just something about how the art form itself portrays those things, I have a familiarity with. And it's something that I'm not necessarily accustomed to reading in a book because you don't have the literal drawings of the characters. As an example, in a lot of anime and manga, I'll use Full Metal Alchemist as an example because I love Full Metal Alchemist, but randomly the characters will like turn into ghosts when they're scared about something and they're drawn really silly. Or in Apothecary Diaries, our main character suddenly is like a little cat for no reason, really, it feels like. So that being shown in some panels or within a shot of an anime, it just fits, and we're accustomed to it if we are familiar with anime and manga. And it's like if you took that but you read about it, it's not like they're literally described ever as turning into animals or ghosts or anything, but there is that flair for the dramatic from these characters that at first I wasn't connecting with, I wasn't clicking with, but then once it kind of all snapped into place as like, oh, that's the feeling that this book is giving me, then I don't know, for some reason, once that happened, I just had a lot of fun with it. And the setup is that you're following this fallen god who is trying to gain his godhood back, and the deal he has made with his brother, who is the one that sentenced him, is that he has to basically almost be like a detective and find people within their mystical lives, because there are humans and then there are these mystical beings, and so he's kind of like an investigator who investigates crimes to do with mystical beings, and he has to solve a certain amount of cases and find enough of these criminals, and so that's what he has to do. And then our other character is a Gumiho, and she is somebody who he kind of has on his list of people that he's trying to look into. And so she decides what better way to get him off of her tails, we'll say, than to be his assistant and make sure that anytime he's getting onto her case, she can mess with all of the details and get him off of her trail. But within all of that, there is also a greater threat that actually kind of brings these two characters together. So there is a romantic subplot for those of you that like romantic subplots in your stories. It's absolutely over the top, a lot of fun. I can't stop saying the word fun in regards to that one because that's truly what it is. Soulless is hilarious. So the setup for this story, it's very much the Regency era where everybody's expected to be prim and proper. So it is somewhat feeling like historical fantasy, but within this story you are also seeing that people that happen to be werewolves or vampires, they are known to exist and they live among humans. They function within society. There are laws as to how they are meant to go about what they do. And our main character is somebody who is soulless, meaning that they can essentially counter the various powers that other beings have. So for example, if it's a full moon and somebody turns into a werewolf, if our character ends up touching that person, it will return them into their human form. So they have offsetting abilities. There is something sinister going on within the city where it seems like all these beings are suddenly being killed or targeted, and that includes our main character. And so she is trying to get to the bottom of things. The tabs in this are pretty much exclusively things that made me laugh. It's super funny, and everybody is, they're both over the top and exceptionally reserved all the time, but everybody's shady and just insulting each other, but in subtle ways that aren't really that subtle. If you've read any kind of Regency stories, I think you'll understand what I mean there. The author captures it in a way that is an absolute blast. Both of those are such a good time. The last two are the ones that are uplifting and charming. The first one I'll mention would be The Wishing Game. This is a play on the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory story where a young woman has an opportunity to go to this elderly author's home. He was famous for writing all these children's books, and her and a collection of other people are selected. They go to his home, and then because I probably don't have to say more because of the connection between Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, you can kind of guess that there is sort of this, the old man is eccentric, and maybe there's like this life lesson that's being taught along the way. This is almost borderline cheesy in how cotton candy cute the story is, because our main character is somebody who desperately wishes that she could adopt this young boy that she works with. She is a teacher, and he is somebody who has kind of been in and out of foster care. He's the sweetest little boy, and she so badly wants to be able to adopt him, but she doesn't really have the means of doing this as far as the financial means. And it is through potentially this little experiment, we'll say, this little challenge, this Charlie and the Chocolate Factory-like challenge, that maybe she'll have some ways of being closer to this little boy. It's very heartwarming, it's very cute, but there are some aspects to the story that explore trauma, and especially trauma to do with children who get kind of lost in the system. So there are heavier topics alluded to or shown, but I would say the story overall is very uplifting despite its sometimes serious subject matters. And that's true for this last book for today, which would be The Downstairs Girl. This follows a young Asian American woman during a time, if this isn't clear, this one is completely historical fiction. The other one was not fantasy, it was just contemporary. But this story, we're looking at a certain time when women in America did not have as many rights. And so you're seeing a lot of women come together. They're trying to unite so that they can fight together for more rights. And our main character is somebody who very much believes in this cause. However, as a result of being Asian American, there are a lot of people who don't want her to represent the cause because they see her as somehow pulling away from it and negating a lot of their points, which is absolutely terrible. So when I said that there are serious subject matters in this, you can already guess as to what those things are. However, I do think that this story is uplifting in the sense that our main character is unbelievably witty and charismatic, and you see this exceptionally through the fact that through some unusual circumstances, she essentially starts her own column, we'll say, like an advice column. And I won't give details as to how this comes about because that's kind of the fun of the story. But she ends up writing back to people who write in, and sometimes she's extremely helpful, sometimes she's extremely understanding and empathetic, other times she's exceptionally sassy, which is a lot of fun. But really, uplifting and charming. I don't think too many other books fit that better than The Downstairs Girls. That's it for this list of books that are cozy, fun, and or happy. If you're interested in seeing more of the cozy fantasy recommendations, I'll have my cozy fantasy video in the description bar down below. And of course, if you have your own recommendations, feel free to leave those in the comments down below. I know for myself, I would love to see them. I am often pulled in when somebody tells me something is very sad. My friends make fun of me for it because the second you're like, oh, it's devastating, I'm like, what was that book? I do feel like every now and then I need more books that are charming and uplifting and fun and happy, so I would also really appreciate any of your recommendations. If you're interested in any of these, I'll have them linked, but thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.